Having a child is a big commitment to the future and has a big, what we called carbon legacy.
Can we put all of our faith into technology saving us once again?
I think my question to those people that think population growth is okay is saying, well, indefinitely?
Is it okay to still have children?
More and more people today are talking about opting out of parenthood because of their concerns related to overpopulation and climate change.
Should we really be afraid of overpopulation?
Dave, for the record, I am not having a baby.
To have or not to have a baby? That is the question that's starting to get some news coverage, and the topic we'll explore next on the Growth Busters podcast.
Calling, 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 calling. Call the Growth Busters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast about sustainable living. I'm Dave Gardner, co-host, and I'm joined today by
Erika Arias, environmental activist and co-host of the Growth Busters podcast. For
cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org.
Are low birth rates something to be concerned about? Do we have a moral responsibility to be fruitful and multiply? Today, we'll speak with sociologist and Childfree pioneer Dr. Amy Blackstone about the child-free choice, the role society and culture have on our reproductive future, and the environmental impact we can have by limiting our fertility.
But first, a quick note. I want to apologize, Erika, to you and to our listeners for the long silence between episodes. As you know, Erika, it's pretty hard to bust growth, save the planet, and keep this podcast going. Very challenging. So every now and then we fall a little bit behind. But I want to mention, if you're listening to this podcast and you have an interest in helping out as a producer or perhaps an editor of the podcast, give us a shout at podcast@growthbusters.org. Now, Erika, one more thing before we get into it. I want to quickly give a shout out to Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old climate activist who sailed across the Atlantic rather than fly in a plane to attend the UN 2019 Climate Action Summit in New York City just 1 week ago as we record this episode. One thing, you can't accuse Greta of beating around the bush, can you?
Not at all.
I just want to share with you just a brief part of her remarks at that Climate Action Summit.
Great, let's listen.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
As usual, very powerful Miss Greta.
Mm-hmm.
When she calls herself one of the lucky ones, not only is she recognizing her privilege and using it towards the greater good of the planet and all of the living species living within it, but she's also drawing attention to the fact that so many people in power, politicians, leaders, all of whom are also very privileged, are living in complacency and really removed from the harsh realities of the world that we live in today. They keep making false promises and continue to place all of their hope and faith into teenagers. How dare they? So I guess, how does this clip relate to the child-free choice and the topic that we will be discussing today? I guess in a lot of ways, what comes to mind is first this us versus them mindset and how people continue to think that it's okay to have as many children as they want in the world, mostly people living in very privileged nations like we do. And they think about this because biologically, that's sort of the whole essence of life. And while that's biologically true, we're humans and we are so much more. And I guess just truth be told, everybody thinks that their children are going to be the next Einstein, the next Elon Musk. And unfortunately, we can't continue to breed like bunnies and hope that that's going to end up that way, because where are all the Elons and Einsteins today? We are still in a climate crisis, and I don't really see any of those people doing anything about it. Greta is one of them, but that's one of how many.
Yep, but at the same time, there are more and more women today who are seriously rethinking the whole idea of motherhood because of climate change. Almost every day there's new coverage of that, which I think is really good to be having that conversation. And that's one of the reasons why we thought it was good timing for Dr. Blackstone's book and for us to have a chat with Amy. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I had a different kind of a reaction to Greta because she said something that just blew me away, and she brought up economic growth, as the villain in this, or one of the villains. And I mean, it's really good that we hear that because we don't hear that often enough. And so I looked around a little to see if her referring to economic growth as a part of the climate problem, if that sparked a torrent of criticism, because that's what I expected. And sure enough, it did. And it was all garbage, I will tell you. We could spend a whole episode on it, but I really don't want to even give any oxygen to all of the misassumptions and lack of science and worship of economics that I saw. But there was an interesting conversation about it actually on Real Time with Bill Maher just the other night. Barney Frank was one of the guests on there, and he went out of his way to mention that he didn't agree with her denouncement of capitalism. That was the way he saw it. Her calling up economic growth was disparaging capitalism. And to some degree, he's right in connecting the two. But if he disagrees with her putting that in its place, well, he's wrong about that. But I did find in the process a couple of surprising positive responses, and I want to just bring up two real quickly. One was Bill McKibben, who was one of the co-founders of 350.org. He tweeted, "Big thanks to Greta Thunberg for straightforwardly taking on the fairy tale of eternal economic growth." So that was good to see, especially since I know Bill McKibben understands the damage that we're doing in pursuit of economic growth, but I haven't really seen him talk about that in all of his 350.org climate activism. He hasn't been trying to convince us that we need to stop worshiping economic growth, probably because he chooses his battles carefully. So it was nice to see him congratulate her for that. And then I also found a really nice piece published at The Conversation, written by Jennifer Ellen Good, and I'll include a link to this piece in our show notes. It was titled, "Greta Thunberg's Radical Climate Change Fairy Tale is Exactly the Story We Need." A couple of quick quotes from that. What I find especially significant about the talk is her inclusion of a critique of economic growth in the climate change story frame. Thoughtful and well-researched scholarship makes clear that economic growth and environmental crises are related, and yet non-academic writing linking endless growth economics and climate change is almost non-existent. I have conducted a content analysis on the Canadian Major Dailies database. In the 12 months prior to Thunberg's talk, there were 850 newspaper articles, including opinion editorials and letters, with climate change in the headline. Of these, 44% were related to the economy, and yet only one letter to the editor raised concerns about economic growth in the era of climate change.
Wow.
Well, I just want to say that I'm not too surprised at that, because pretty consistently policymakers worldwide have linked climate change to growth, but they've linked it by insisting that any climate change mitigation not hamper economic growth. And that's probably why she found, 44% of the stories and editorials and letters did include economy and climate change, but they were probably all saying we dare not risk our economy in our efforts to combat climate change. So anyway, really nice, intelligent piece by Jennifer Ellen Good, and I will include a link to that in the show notes.
Great. Okay, so let's get into today's topic. I'd like to start by playing just a moment from a program on Al Jazeera English called The Stream, Will Not Having Children Save the Planet? We included a clip from that program in the tease of this episode, along with a clip from the BBC report Overpopulation, Will We Run Out of Space? And a piece from AOC's now famous Instagram video where she questioned having children.
Actually, what you're saying, I hear what you're saying, and it makes an awful lot of sense. But I feel that so many people in the world would just say, I just want to have a baby. Like, I love my partner. We want to have a family. What you're saying to me sounds like you are standing up and giving a speech. But there are so many people who just want to have a family. They want to have kids. They want to have kids who look like them. How do you have that conversation with them? Because I feel you're up here and they just want to have kids.
I think that was an important clip to share, Dave, because in watching that episode, I felt that the hostess was very uncomfortable with this conversation altogether, especially at that part of the clip where she asks Ash to speak to her as if she's just a woman and not as if she's a politician. First of all, I don't think Ash was speaking to her as if she was a politician at all. She was just, providing her with information about our world and what's happening and why we should think about our decision to have children today in this world. And so I felt that she was obviously very uncomfortable with this discussion. And what I think is also interesting is she said, speak to me as if I'm just a woman in love and I want to have a baby. I want to have a baby with my partner. And I think that's just feeding into this whole myth that as women, we're all supposed to want to have babies, that we enter into romantic relationships and we're all just eventually supposed to have this desire to have children and move into this stage of the relationship where that's just expected. And so she's feeding into that by saying that, but that's just not the case. And I think that's what myself and Amy and other child-free activists do in trying to really deconstruct that message and really show that that's a myth.
Yeah, and I think she was guilty, the host, of oversimplifying the example that she was trying to get Ash to respond to. I suspect that the host didn't really think that it's that basic and unconsidered of a decision in every case. But yeah, you and Amy and me included now are definitely trying to discourage that kind of just gut level decision about it. So it's kind of unfortunate that it came across as being just mischaracterizing the way that ought to go. Is that a fair way to say it?
Perfect.
I do want to mention that we'll include a link in the show notes to that piece of video. There was an episode of the stream titled, "Will Not Having Children Save the Planet?"
Well, without further ado, I think we will welcome Miss Amy Blackstone.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Just to give a little bit of background on Amy, Dr. Blackstone is a sociologist whose areas of expertise include the child-free choice and child-free families, workplace harassment, and civic engagement. She is a professor of the Sociology Department and the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center at the University of Maine. Dr. Blackstone's research has appeared in a variety of academic and media sources, including the New York Times, Public Radio, NBC, and other national, regional, and international outlets. I also want to give a special thanks to Dr. Blackstone's husband, Lance Blackstone, for his contributions to the book. He shares a male perspective on the child-free choice, and he also guest blogs on their shared blog titled "We're Not Having a Baby." Amy and Lance have been married since '95, and they are happily child-free. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. And thank you especially for that shout out to Lance. It's funny, I just gave a talk at a bookstore on Wednesday night of this week, and one of the people in the audience asked, well, where are men in the book? And I said, they're in the afterword.
Yeah.
Which they're really not only relegated to the afterword, but Lance likes to joke about how he gets the final word. He doesn't get much word, but he gets the last word of the book. So he'll appreciate the shout out.
That's great.
Well, we need to hear from us men a lot less,
yes.
But make us a lot more responsible, I think.
I want to say, first of all, congratulations to you, Amy, on winning the 2019 Sociologist for Women of Society Feminist Activism Award. I want to kind of hear a little bit more about that. And anything I failed to mention in my intro, please tell us a little bit about you.
Well, thanks for the acknowledgement of the award, too. That was really exciting. A former student nominated me for it. So it was meaningful to get, but especially so because my work with students is very important to me. And actually sort of related to my choice not to have children. One of the questions that I get all the time and that probably other child-free people get all the time is, what is your legacy? What kind of legacy are you leaving? And how do you make a difference for young people? And for me, the answer to that is easy because I have hundreds, and at this point in my career, probably thousands of students that I've really had the pleasure and the privilege of working with, and it's been wonderful.
So you have a big, happy family.
Yeah, you really do. In fact, you probably remember this. I should probably share with our listeners, but I reached out to Amy about almost exactly a year ago when I was just figuring out and formulating my academic plans and research ideas. Amy was obviously a hero of mine back then and still is today because she's a pioneer in academia on this topic. And so I feel so privileged to have you here on the show. And I actually should say that Dave and I wanted to have you here much earlier for not only the release of your book back on June 11th, but also for International Childfree Day, which was this past August 1st. I celebrate every year. It's a very special day to me, as I'm sure it is for you. But how did you celebrate?
It's funny, when we got involved, it was Laura Carroll who really picked up International Childfree Day again a few years ago, and she asked Lance and I to join in the effort in terms of promoting it and then helping sort of form the criteria for the award and helping to make a decision about who would win the award. And so when we got involved that first year, we thought, oh my gosh, we've got to plan something huge to celebrate. This is a big deal. And then as the date got closer and we couldn't come up with anything to do, we realized, you know, for us, every day is child-free day. And one of the things we love about being child-free is that it's the choice that we've made for ourselves. We're living the life of our choosing. And for that, you know, we're grateful every day and we celebrate every day. So to be perfectly honest, we mark it in terms of acknowledging that is the day and mentioning it to each other. But beyond that, we haven't done anything formal. And part of that was a choice because we realized, you know, every day we get to live the life that we've chosen for ourselves.
Great. Yeah, agree with that.
Very interesting.
Dave, did you celebrate?
You know, I'm embarrassed to say no, but I've added that to my editorial calendar. I'm going to have to just consult so that I don't miss any of these important days. Now I never miss World Population Day, never miss Earth Overshoot Day, never miss Earth Day. Black Friday, I actually sort of uncelebrate. Quick side note here is Amy's going to sound a little different for the rest of this conversation because her headset fell apart right in the middle of this great conversation. And so the rest of this interview will be with the built-in microphone on her system. So I know everybody's going to notice, so I thought I would explain that. I wanted to ask you, Amy, right before we lost you, I was thinking about this. So you're talking about this notion of some women who aren't able to have as many children as they desire. And I noticed that was brought up in that program, The Stream, that Erika brought up, where you were one of the panelists on Al Jazeera. And the representative from UN Women, Shara Razavi, that was a real concern that she had. And I just found myself thinking, because I'm a real sustainable population advocate, that's a problem I really don't want to fix. Do you hate me for that?
I don't hate you, Dave. No. And I think that the thing that got overlooked there is, on the one hand, you know, I share the UN representative's concern about choice and about reproductive choice and about allowing women the chance to make the choice that's right for them about parenthood. At the same time, I think that what was missing from that conversation was acknowledgement that we construct our own culture and our own cultural ideals and norms. And in the world that we live in today, motherhood and womanhood have been linked to each other. And in today's culture, at least in the US and in many places across the world, there's this idea that women aren't real women or can't be real women unless or until they become mothers. So we're socialized to believe that the most important thing we can do as women is become mothers. And if that's the world that we're raised in, then of course we're going to aspire to become mothers, or many of us will. So I think that on the one hand, yes, we should listen to women, we should believe women, and women should be allowed to make the choice they want to make for their reproductive lives. On the other hand, we have to look at the bigger picture and what is the ideology that they're being raised with, and maybe we need to think about shifting that ideology. And I think if we did, we would see fewer women expressing a desire to become a mother.
Excellent.
Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. I will probably spend the rest of my life dedicated to that mission of really reconstructing that narrative and making a new one where the choice to be child-free is actually celebrated in the way that parenthood is celebrated. Because nothing is worse when you hear somebody tell you that they want to have kids eventually, if even not now, but eventually, and then you ask them why. And they can't really tell you why other than some biological imperative to reproduce. And it's something I personally just do not understand. I will probably spend my life trying to understand that as well. And I guess related to that, related to women not having as many children as they desire, I think that's also interesting. Just what isn't said about that is the world that we live in today, the social, economic, political issues that we're faced with. Climate is another one, but I think in addition to environmental issues, women and men are more sensitive to this world, and raising a child is very different than raising a child decades ago. Do you think this is a legitimate concern, Amy, or do you think those who place more faith in or on planetary expansion and technological innovation to support growing numbers are wiser than, say, people who are less optimistic like myself and Dave? Can I say you as well?
Yep, you can speak for me there.
Hopefully that made sense.
I always try to skirt my way around hard and fast dichotomies. So to me, it's not an either or. I mean, I'm a fan of science, and I think the idea of exploring other possibilities for places to live is really cool. So I don't know that doing that means that then it's okay for everybody to have as many children as they want. We shouldn't be concerned about the earth. So, and now I've completely lost track of your question.
I know it's because you were thinking about how much rocket fuel it would take to actually move even 1 billion people from Earth to Mars. And no matter how smart Elon Musk is, it's going to be impossible to move even 10% of the human population off of this planet. I know you were thinking about that in the back of your head.
I just asked if it's a legitimate concern to put all of our faith in planetary expansion and our technological innovation to support growing numbers.
Yeah, well, I definitely don't think we should put all of our faith in that. It's hard for me, it's hard to argue with the idea that we're facing a crisis right now in terms of this planet that we're all on and that we share. And we don't have a solution right now other than to try to scale back our growth. And so I don't think the answer is to rely only on technological innovation, if that answers your question.
You brought up the vast disparity between the footprint of someone born in what I would call the overdeveloped world, somewhere like the U.S. or Western Europe, Australia, that kind of place, and someone born in really any country in Africa, as you said, huge difference in impact. But I want to follow up on that and find out, give you a chance to kind of articulate why that matters. Why do people need to think about that?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I think there are lots of reasons people need to think about that. I think in the West, one reason to think about that is that there is so much we can and should be doing to reduce our consumption, be aware of our consumption. And I say this as a person who doesn't have kids, but travels a whole lot and loves to do it. So I'm not, I'm speaking to myself as well.
Well, I guess you kind of bought an offset. You got the world's biggest offset by not having kids.
Well, that's kind of what I tell myself when I'm taking off in an airplane, but I don't know. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to give myself that excuse.
Yeah, we're not going to give you a pass on that.
I think that's reasonable. So anyway, I think one reason to be aware of that is to recognize and understand that there's a lot we can do to change our consumption patterns, particularly in the West. For me, another reason to be aware of it, I guess, is probably less linked to the differences in consumption or the difference in impact of a new child born in an African country versus a Western European country. And that has to do with, going back to a point I made earlier, women's access to reproductive health care and to choice. And I don't know that in the nations where we see the highest fertility rates that mothers are always making the choice to have more children. Yeah. I think a lot of it is about access to education, access to care, access to work. I mean, we see that around the world in nations where women do have better access to reproductive health care and education and work. Fertility rates are much lower. So another great solution would be to provide, equal opportunities to girls and women, and I think we might see a reduction in fertility rates.
Well, I think that was an important answer, because I think what you've said is that making that distinction doesn't mean that you don't think we should have some concerns about high birth rates in the parts of the world that have high birth rates, but we shouldn't be focusing all of our energy on there and ignoring cleaning up our own backyard. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because say we followed the Paris Agreement to the T and said we just were not going to pay attention to numbers at all. We were just going to really emphasize our consumption patterns and really try to reduce emissions without really having to pay attention to population. Do you think that we and the developed world are really prepared to give up what we have in order to evenly distribute our resources to the rest of the world suffering? I think about all of the children born on the other side that are assigned an early death. So I like that you said earlier, 1 American child is, unfortunately, this is kind of dark, but unfortunately it's contributing to mass systematic harm in that it's taking away resources from another child, another family on the other side. And also there's adoption. If the desire to parent is actually there and you really, truly want to parent, I can't compare adoption to actually having your own biological child. I don't understand it, but I know that there's not an equal comparison there. But if your desire is to parent, why not give another child those resources? I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's one that's tough for me too, because I obviously don't come from a place of having given birth to a child. So I can't speak about what that feels like, but I do know that another cultural myth we hold, aside from the one that womanhood and motherhood are the same thing, is that women have a maternal instinct, an innate drive to have children, to rear children. There's not scientific evidence that, there's evidence that we have a drive to have sex and that sex sometimes results in the production of more humans, but a drive to actually raise a biological child, we don't have evidence of that kind of thing. And if that's true, I, like you, can't help but think, well, okay, so for folks who do feel compelled to parent, wouldn't adoption fulfill that need in the same way that creating your own child would?
So I'd love to speak to that, because I'm the one person in this conversation who's had kids. My maternal instinct is missing in action, that's for sure. But
your paternal instinct.
It is the most amazing experience, the birth of your child as a parent. I've never said this, in any public platform, because I'm so busy trying to convince people not to go down the road I went down. I had 2 children. I stopped after 2 because I thought that I was doing my part to not contribute to human overpopulation. I just didn't know that I really needed to stop at 1 or 0. But I did it, so I know a little bit about it, and it's an amazing experience. It's an amazing experience to raise a child. And there is a little bit of a difference between being there at the birth of your progeny versus just adopting a child. But of course, most of your life, just the family life and the process of parenting and mentoring a young mind, you can definitely achieve that through adoption. And I think Travis Reeder, who I'm sure you both are very familiar with Travis's work, he's a bioethicist, and he wrote an interesting, fairly short book about this dilemma, do we have a moral responsibility to have fewer children or to have no children on a planet that has too many? And he was reluctant, as I think most ethicists are, to actually kind of give us his final definitive answer. But I think he sort of reached the conclusion that there's a pretty strong case to be made for having one, because then you get the experience. But you don't have a whole lot of moral case on an overpopulated planet for having more than one, because having the second child doesn't give you experiences that you didn't already have by having that first child. So I think that's a pretty strong argument for, at least if you really want to have children, at least just choosing to have a one-child family.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I confess, I'll contradict myself now. I share in the book that never very seriously, but over the years I did at times consider surrogacy for folks who might want to be parents, because I was curious about the experience of pregnancy and childbirth.
Wow.
I just wanted to know what it was like. And, what is this thing that everybody says is like the penultimate experience that a woman can have? Never followed through on it, and have no regrets about not following through on it. But I get the, I can relate to the sense of wanting to share this experience that so many other people have.
Wow. Yeah.
Plus stretch marks. Who doesn't want stretch marks?
Well, there are parts of the experience that was always happy doing without. But it is, you sit in a group of women, and I just went to France last year for a week with 13 other women. I was the only non-parent in the group. And, one of the frequent topics of conversation is experiences with pregnancy and childbirth. And those are conversations that I can't be a part of. I can't contribute to, because I haven't had that experience that so many women share.
I can't say I ever want to be able to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of a nut.
I have a borderline phobia of it. We can just call it a phobia. But this is all kind of reminded me of a part in your book where you talk about the social norms against vasectomies. And so we talk a lot about this, womanhood equals motherhood idea in our society and how we want to deconstruct that. But I think in a lot of ways, parenthood is also very connected to masculinity. And I think that is a strong reason why vasectomies are just really rare. The procedure sort of represents a loss of power, loss of masculinity, and it sort of.
It's loving Dave's faces right now.
I'm just saying what the research says, Dave. I don't believe this.
It's a load of crap. Yeah.
Just for all of our listeners, if you have a vasectomy, call me. That's actually very attractive to somebody like me. So yeah, I'm all for it. But I guess.
And you're going to be celebrating World Vasectomy Day, are you not?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I guess, Amy, how do you think the global perspective on vasectomies influences widely accepted beliefs on masculinity versus femininity and people's beliefs of what they need to achieve in life in order to fulfill these socially constructed ideas?
Yeah, this is one of those issues that just drives me bananas. And it's linked to this whole bigger cultural ideology around gender and gender norms. And in many cultures, a man's virility is linked to his masculinity, and his ability to show that he can reproduce is linked to his masculinity. And I wish that we could change the culture around vasectomy. And I write about this in the book. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about vasectomy and about what it's like to get one. There's a great film, I don't know if you've heard about Maxine Trump's film To Kid or Not to Kid.
Yeah.
So she has a scene in it of her husband getting a vasectomy. And the thing I love about that scene is I had no idea. I had read that it's a pretty simple procedure. You're in and you're out and you're on your way. It was literally just minutes. I couldn't believe it. And they filmed during the vasectomy, and he's talking his way through it. He seems perfectly fine. And I hope everybody watches that to help dispel the myths. And I know World Vasectomy Day shares, or I think they do, they stream vasectomies happening, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Very cool.
I think all of that kind of work will hopefully go a long way to dispel many of the fears and myths around vasectomy.
But this is a good chance to bash men, though, a little more, because...
Oh, yeah. And apparently they're more effective than long-acting reversible contraceptives, something like an IUD or tubal ligation, which is not reversible. But that sort of baffles me. And, how is that possible? It's 2019.
Well, part of it is that men are just big babies, but...
Agree.
But I didn't know that there was this... Amy, thanks for enlightening us, though, about this fact that there's the virility component. And, I've read articles from time to time about how men avoid being green because it doesn't seem to be masculine. So I'm adding that to the list. They won't give up their pickup truck and drive a more fuel-efficient vehicle, even though it's just them driving and there's nothing in the bed of that pickup truck. Apparently they won't get a vasectomy either. Golly, I don't know what we're going to do. Well, I'm definitely glad the women are taking charge now.
So I know what we're going to do. I have to defend men here for a second. As a sociologist, my inclination is always to blame our culture. It's not individual men's fault because they were raised in the same culture we all were. And, what they're responsible for is working together with women to change the culture.
Very well said. Very diplomatic.
Yeah. It's definitely our culture to blame. It reminds me of some new research in Australia where more men are choosing to be child-free. Apparently, some new research from Deakin University led by, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Imogen Smith, explores why men choose not to have children and the impact that decision has on their relationships. We'll share the link at the end of the show. I think it's a really great piece from ABC Media. It's wonderful because we just don't hear enough about the male experience. And apparently they're getting more vasectomies over there and more women are even opting to be child-free in Australia. Apparently I need to move there. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 24% of Australian women will never have children, and child-free homes will overtake the number of households with children by 2031. So that's pretty neat.
I wonder what is different about Australia so my own research really is mostly focused on the US, but I'm curious if there has been some major shift in bigger cultural thinking about the child-free choice that has led to this change in Australia that we're not seeing, at least to the same extent, in the US.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know. Yeah. I'm curious, has any of your research dug into the question of whether, let's say, women or men or couples who have chosen to be child-free, are they all as selfish and self-absorbed as Erika here is?
Hey.
So I'm of two minds on this selfish question. On the one hand, sure, yes, they are as selfish and self-absorbed as Erika and all the rest of us, because they've made a choice about what they want their lives to look like, and they're living it. And everybody else be damned, they're doing what they want to do. So I guess in some ways that is selfish. If that's true, then we get to share that label with parents who have opted into parenthood. Now, I get that not all parents chose that role. I think the figure is about half or just under half of pregnancies that go to full term are unplanned. But in terms of parents who've intentionally gone into that role because it's a role that they wanted, that they believed would be fulfilling, then I guess they're selfish also. So maybe we're all selfish. Another way to look at it is to think about how we spend our time and how or whether we contribute to the good of society. And if we look at that, we could look at things like rates of volunteering in your community. And by that measure, parents and non-parents are about the same. We have similar rates of volunteering, although folks who don't have kids are more likely to intensively volunteer. So they might put more hours into their volunteering, which makes sense because they probably have more hours available than parents do.
Sure.
They give to charity at about the same rate. And so, I don't know. I mean, if you look at it that way, maybe we're not selfish. But if you think of selfishness as living the life that you believe will be fulfilling for you, then sure, we're all selfish.
And who really calls somebody selfish for their decision to not parent, right? It's, I think, I agree with you. I think we are all, or I don't know if you said this, but you said we can look at it this way. I think we all are inherently selfish. We are. And I think, we assign meaning, whatever that means to live a meaningful life. For some people, that means having a family, having children. For other people, like myself, that is not involved in my process. So, yeah, we're all selfish at the end of the day.
Well, I just want to say, I'm thinking more and more women, though, who are making this decision to be child-free out of concern for the environment or the world that they might be bringing children into. That seems like a very selfless decision.
Yeah, that is actually a point that a number of the people that I interviewed made, especially those who interviewed a few animal rights activists, and then the folks who also had mentioned overpopulation or concern for the children who are already here, do think of their choice as more selfless than selfish. They've made it because they're concerned about either the planet or the people on the planet or both.
Yeah. On friendship in the book, I think this might have been part of Lance's piece in the book, but I really like that you wrote about the loss of friendships after friends disappear into a new role or a new chapter of parenthood. I think there's a lot of room for future research here in this area, and research I hope to conduct in the future, not just on the loss of friendships, but on the loss of romantic relationships, when partners just do not agree on the decision to parent. It's a really sad thing, but it's common, and I've experienced loss in both areas, friends, romantic partners. So I really, really love that you added that as a part in your book.
Well, thank you.
I was going to say I have a best Lance quote from the book. What was my favorite? Can I share it?
Please.
It says, "It seems to me that we've constructed a world in which the historically uncontrollable outcome of having children is driven by the desire to have sex, is considered the socially desirable outcome pretty much at any cost. To me, this is like saying the historically uncontrollable outcome of dying, which is driven by our desire to dive deeply underwater and stay there for an extended period of time, is the desirable outcome."
Go Lance.
Yes.
Oh, he goes on.
Lance.
Lance goes on.
Oh, right.
This is the best part. He says, "But we've got scuba gear and submarines and bathyscaphes now. You can dive deeply underwater and stay there for an extended period of time without dying. We just need to adjust to the reality we live in when it comes to procreation. Simply put, you can and should choose to have children or not." And I think this is just so perfectly put, because the comparison between having children and dying is hilarious to me, personally, because I, admittingly compare parenthood to the death of my freedom. So when people ask me, will you ever have children? Oh, will you change your mind? No, because that to me symbolizes the death of my life that I love today, my freedom. It's everything to me. So I really loved that quote.
But let's make sure that we put a exclamation point on that, because people need to know. They need to know. It will ruin your life. It is the end of all of the excitement and the fun as soon as you're a parent.
And Dave would know. Dave
You're
would know.
saying this as the authority in the group on this.
You give up sleep. You give up golf. You give up sex. I mean, it is, I don't know why anyone would want to have kids. And I'm going to, a phone call of apology to my 2 kids.
Dave Gardner says, "It is the most amazing experience that will ruin your life."
I guess that should be the title of this podcast episode. But,
right.
Hopefully everybody knows I'm kidding about that. But it is, it does change your life dramatically.
Yeah.
So I think you're right you should be a little bit terrified, and you should consider it carefully. I just can't believe it's shocking that nearly half of the pregnancies in the United States are not planned.
Yeah. That doesn't mean that people don't, ultimately come to accept and be joyful about it. But yeah.
Yeah, you should definitely plan that one.
I think that just speaks to it's just an assumed part of life. And when you ask people in the community, as I often do, about whether they want to have children in the future, a lot of people just say, I don't know yet. And it's sort of just assumed to happen. Well, if it happens, it happens. But that's a really high risk to play. And I don't understand that either.
Yeah, I think one thing that we keep coming back to in our conversation reminds me of something I realized I should have done when I started this research over 10 years ago. And that is, I should have been speaking with parents, because, one of my soapbox issues and part of what I hope the takeaway from my book is that we have a choice and we should be thoughtful about the choice that we make. And so I, decided to examine how people who are child-free go about that process, how they make that choice, and how they are or are not thoughtful about that choice. But I realized early in that, I really should be asking parents, because it's parenthood that we forget is a choice. And, everybody is interested in, why we opt out of it, because it's assumed that because that's the thing that takes thought. But we should also be encouraging parents to go into that path or follow that path after lots of thought. That too is a choice. So non-parenthood is a choice, but parenthood is and should be a choice, and it should be something that we examine more closely. Why are people doing it? Why are they compelled to do it? And maybe if we encouraged more people to think deeply about it before they made the plunge, we might have fewer people taking that plunge.
Well said.
Well, let me drop another bombshell on you two. Let me confess that both of my children were accidents.
That's great. So was I.
They were accidents because I was concerned. I didn't think we could afford kids yet. I wasn't ready. We had not made the decision. We're not having children. But here's the deal, Amy. You've probably run into this a million times in interviews with people. We just sort of assumed we would have kids at some point.
Yep.
And to be honest with you, we never really had the kind of conversation that every couple should have, the really serious, weeks-long, months-long conversation about that choice.
Yeah, and I think you're more normal than the rest of us. I mean,
that's scary.
But I think we need to change that. I mean, I really think there should be no assumption. The assumption should be, I need to think about this and decide what kind of life I want for myself, what kind of future I want to see in the world, how my choice will impact others. Wouldn't that be a great health class for junior high and high school students to have to go through?
Duh, yes.
Speaking of which, your book is actually being taught in some classes right now, right?
Yeah, I know of a few sociologists who have assigned it in a families class and a sociology of gender class. I love that families classes are starting to talk about families that don't include children, because if you look at most textbooks for families courses, for a while, childlessness was never mentioned, or only mentioned as, the sad outcome of some marriages. And then it got maybe a page in a book, like a little side box about, some people choose not to have kids. Are they still families? And now it's being more incorporated into the sociology of the family, which I think is great, probably because that's one of my own personal soapbox issues. I insist that Lance and I are a family. I'm very deliberate about talking about our unit as a family, because we do all the same things families do. We provide companionship for each other. We provide financial support for each other. We run a household together. So I think it's a good thing that we're starting to think about the reality that child-free people can and do form families.
Yeah, I like seeing that out there as well. I think it's like average is 2 to 3% of the child-free choice depicted in textbooks from the 50s all the way until early 2000s. And that's just really not all right in this day and age. So it's really great that it's being, even when I was in college, I had a course where one of the key assignments was having an electronic baby. You had to raise it for the duration of the semester, and you had to feed it and raise it all the way up until college. And so, of course, being who I am, I requested an alternative assignment and asked my professor to allow for me to choose to be who I am, which is child-free, and to, write an essay on my role in the world, or really whatever she thought that would have been adequately comparable to raising a child. I would have made a whole project or a whole presentation on this choice. But she said, no, this is part of the assignment. You're raising a child and that's it. I don't know if that was meant or if it was just easier to assign the whole class this assignment, but it's really nice to see that that is becoming more included in sociology, hopefully psych courses as well, because college really is the place where people start to ask these questions and shape their worldviews and really set up their plans for the future. I know that it was for me. So,
Amy, before we wrap it up, are there some tips? Are there some things that our listeners could be or should be doing to help us affect the changes that you see are needed?
Yes. I think the most obvious, based on what we've just been talking about, is do your research, do your homework, think about what you want your own life to look like, and recognize that whether or not you choose to be a parent is indeed your choice. and so don't make the assumption that you have to become a parent, because that's what we're taught to believe. That's what we're told when we grow up, but it's not true. So spend some time, just marinating on that reality, I think is a good thing. I also think that understanding, if you do opt into parenthood, understanding what the impact of your choice is, not just on your own life, but on others. So Erika touched on that, and Dave touched on it. We've all touched on that in this discussion. And, certainly there are environmental impacts that your choice will have, and there are also impacts on other aspects of your life in your community. So I think recognizing that while reproduction and reproductive health is a very personal thing, it also has very far-reaching consequences beyond an individual. So those are some things that I guess I would encourage people to think about.
Isn't there like a knob that they can turn to change the culture?
Wouldn't that be great? Then I'd be out of a job.
I mean, you're talking about good individual action, but otherwise, is the culture only going to change as more and more people do take your advice here? I'm guessing that you don't have a prescription for fixing the cultural
I don't.
issues.
I think we're doing it right now by having this discussion and by you putting it up on the web for people to hear. And I think, when Lance and I started our blog in 2013, one of the things I was doing behind the scenes was working with a couple of undergrad students here at U Maine who were helping me with my research. And one of them was assigned to every day look for stories in the news about people opting out of parenthood. And in 2013, it was a virtually impossible task. I mean, she maybe found something once a month, and it was in some obscure source that nobody was reading, and she only found it because that was her job, to dig for stories in the news about non-parenthood. Today, we have a Google alert on the words child-free and childless, and I don't have time to page through all of the hits that we get every single day. So I think that we are making cultural change simply by talking about this. So it feels small, but it actually does make a difference.
It's great.
Good to hear.
I also just want to say, Amy, thank you so much for just acknowledging the child-free choice as a coming out experience in your book. For me, it was very much a coming out experience, and I think it's important for people to come out. And thank you so much for sharing stories of other women, success stories in the book, and for really just creating a safe space for people like me to feel accepted and less alone in a big world of parents and pronatalists.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed talking with you both.
Same.
Well, this was great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
So, Dave, was there anything you found particularly interesting about our exchange with Amy?
No, I thought it was a total snooze fest.
No!
Just kidding. It was a great conversation, and I really enjoyed having it, and I appreciate the fact that you two put up with, I know I joked a lot in that conversation about we men. I think we men deserve to be the butt of the jokes in a lot of cases, but there was a lot to unpack here, so I would like to chat a little bit before we wrap up the episode about a couple things, and I'm sure you have some things you want to underscore. Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me was just this statement early on that motherhood and womanhood aren't the same thing.
Yeah.
I never would have thought to articulate it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, we did get into the longstanding myth that women have a maternal instinct and a desire to be a mother. But Amy says, no, there's no scientific proof of that. There's a drive to have sex, but there's no evidence of a biological desire to raise children. Were you already aware of that, Erika?
Absolutely. When I hear about this maternal instinct, I have no idea what that is, what that's like. I have asked my mom about it, and it's really just this thing you can't really put into words. My mom just says, well, once you're a mom, you know, but that's just not something I want to know.
But how do you explain how women, this is a generalization, but I've witnessed it more often than not, where when a woman walks into the room with a baby, every other woman in the room just wants to go see that baby, you know?
Not me.
All right.
Not me.
Good to know.
Maybe if you have like a puppy or a cat, I guess that's my maternal instinct for furry babies. I definitely have that, but not for human children. No.
So maybe it's more of a nurturing instinct and not necessarily a drive to be a mother.
Yeah. I really like that Amy emphasizes these social and cultural factors that share a larger part in promoting that myth more so than this biological instinct that we're supposed to want children of our own. So thanks, Amy, for that. I want to say what I found most interesting was the part in Amy's book, and also what she shared with us was how at one point she considered surrogacy and wanted to experience pregnancy and childbirth.
Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah. And it's not common that I hear voluntarily child-free women express that experience or that desire to experience pregnancy or childbirth. And because I'm so far from it, I guess you could say that I normally regard most child-free women, especially academic pioneers like Amy, to share my disinterest in both those things. But clearly that's not the case at all. So I found that really, really interesting. And even more interesting to me was hearing about her trip to France with some of her friends with whom we're all able to share experiences about childbirth and pregnancy, and how she felt unable to relate to the conversation. So that's very much how I felt when my sister had a child and some of my friends had children. I just wasn't able to relate to the conversation in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if this is around the same time that she considered surrogacy, or if it was significant in influencing her desire to experience pregnancy or childbirth. But this story was especially noteworthy to me because there's some literature to suggest the social pressure and how that significantly influences child-free and one-child families' attitudes and decisions towards childbearing. So, in other words, when researchers apply what is called this theory of planned behavior model to examine determinants of reproductive intention when examining reproductive decision-making, they find that our reproductive decisions are significantly influenced by our friends and family. Now, if most of our friends and family and people around us have children and support our decision to have children, and we live in what I would call a very pronatalist society, then the chances are that we are going to feel much more supported to have children than we are to choose not to.
Yeah. I thought it was important. I want to put a spotlight on what Amy underscored in our conversation, that being child-free is a choice, but so is becoming a parent. Because I think we're trying to emerge from this culture where becoming a parent is kind of a mindless default position. And it definitely needs to not be default. It needs to be as considered a choice as the choice to be child-free, if not more so even.
Yeah. I mean, if we didn't say it enough, I'm very pleased with Amy's response about how societies and cultures around the world really expose us to this intertwining of womanhood and motherhood. And I have no doubt that that is a significant piece missing from the conversation, but also missing from the academic literature. Society and culture infect us without us even realizing. And really what we need to do is reshape this ideology. Yeah. And if we did, then maybe we wouldn't see so many people reporting that they wish they had more children than they have. Or maybe, infertility wouldn't be seen as such a detriment to the family. There's this society in, I want to say Scotland, trying to remember, very small society that actually has an environmental ethic for reproduction. And it's really interesting how they sort of view infertility as this, they see it as sort of this omen for the planet and the environment not being a safe place to host children. Spey Bay in Scotland, they call this an ecological ethic of reproduction, and it encourages an environmental perspective that focuses on reducing pollution, climate-related deterioration, and less species endangerment. So, really interesting read. Fascinating. I actually want to visit there now just to maybe in the future I can do some field work there.
Can we put a link in the show notes?
Absolutely. It's a fascinating article. I cited them in a chapter I'm working on, and I found it really interesting because, most of us hear the word infertility and we go around like it's the worst thing in the world. You might as well just, it's death in the family.
Another thing I really loved that Amy confirmed that we're seeing a lot more media coverage of the child-free choice. I mentioned that at the top of this episode, but the media coverage is just exploding. Journalists are finding that a very interesting thing to report on and explore, number one. And number two, it just must be happening so much more often that they can't escape it. Why do you think it's in the news so much now?
I think people are just feeling more comfortable with the decision to not have children. And again, what I really appreciate so much is how Amy calls it a coming out experience in her book. And I've always sort of thought of it that way. And the reason I've thought of it that way is, maybe TMI, but every relationship I've ever had, every romantic relationship I've ever had in my course of dating is, oh, you can't possibly know you don't want children. You'll change your mind. Don't worry. You'll change your mind. And that is incredibly offensive to me as someone who has made the decision very early on. And I know. And I call it a coming out experience because I compare that to telling somebody who is gay, don't worry, you'll change your mind. This is just a phase.
Wow.
And while that is more biological, somebody actually, I had a very good friend of mine ask me, but Erika, is your decision to be child-free biological in the way that being homosexual is biological? And that really challenged me in a very, very positive way because I said, well, I can't prove that it's biological, but I feel it. And maybe perhaps in the similar way that people say, I feel this strong biological imperative to have children. Well, I feel a very strong biological imperative to not have children. So yeah, I do feel offended and I would call it a coming out experience. And for somebody to say, you'll change your mind, rule number one, just don't say that to anybody.
Yeah.
Lastly, I think a central part of all of this conversation, Amy's research, hopefully my future research, is to encourage people to think critically about the decision to parent, whether you choose to parent or not. If more people thought about how their decisions affect the entire planet, then perhaps we wouldn't find ourselves in overshoot and living in environmental catastrophe. Of course, that being said, I don't want to deny that there are so many places around the world where women just don't have access to education, contraceptives, or the freedom to choose. So I consider it my personal duty and what should be all of our duty to strive for equality, and that no good will ever come from denying women equal opportunity. And we will continue to see mass harm in the world if we don't do something about it and spread the message to men and women everywhere that parenthood is a choice.
Very well said. Amy brought up Maxine Trump's film, To Kid or Not to Kid, and we'll include a link to that film. And my plan is to have a good conversation with Maxine about that film. So watch for a future episode with Maxine Trump, the filmmaker behind To Kid or Not to Kid, either on the Growth Busters podcast or our sister podcast, so to speak, the Overpopulation podcast. And I guess I should mention Maxine Trump, no relation to the president whose days are numbered. In wrapping up, I want to mention something. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to this, but we talked a little bit about the journalist Ash Sanders at the top of this episode when we played that moment from that Al Jazeera program, The Stream. Ash wasn't the host. She was actually one of the interviewees in that panel discussion, but she wrote something that was published at BuzzFeed. I think it was published in July. It was titled, "I chose not to have kids because I'm afraid for the planet." And I just really want to publicly compliment Ash Sanders for this really heartfelt and intelligent piece and recommend that everybody read it. So I'll definitely include a link to that in the show notes.
Also in the show notes, if you are interested in having Dr. Amy Blackstone visit you at your local bookstore or anywhere in your community, definitely check out our link to invite her out. She is currently doing a book tour, so very special. Check it out.
We didn't do listener feedback this episode just because we had too much to talk about, but we generally like to include your comments, and we've been getting some interesting feedback, so we're saving it up for the next episode. If you have feedback, any thoughts that you want to share with us about this conversation we've had, you can send an email to podcast@growthbusters.org. You can make a comment at the growthbusters.org website on the page for this episode down below the show notes, or you can message us or comment on the Growthbusters Facebook page or the Growthbusters podcast Facebook page. So there's lots of places. There's no excuse for not telling us how you really feel. So we welcome that. And of course, we also welcome and encourage you to share this podcast with other people. I know you're going to have some friends you've been having this kind of conversation with who are really weighing this decision heavily. So this episode might be of some help to them. So share it around and subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. And of course, the Growthbusters Project is a nonprofit project we run on donations from good-hearted people who recognize the value of having these conversations about sustainable living. So there's a donate button at growthbusters.org to make it easy. So we appreciate your support in that department too. Erika, thanks so much for organizing this conversation with Amy Blackstone. Great episode. So thank you for all your really insightful thoughts that added to this conversation. Take care.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some they just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters. Whoa.